Blackshirts and Reds by Michael Parenti. Section. Suppression of the Left. The anti-communists who took power in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union in 1989 to 91 set about to impose bourgeois dominance over political and cultural life, purging communists from government, the media, universities, professions, and courts. While presenting themselves as democratic reformers, they soon grew impatient with the way democratic forms of popular resistance limited their efforts to install an unrestrained free market capitalism. In Russia, associates of President Boris Yeltsin talked of the, quote, dangers of democracy, and complained that, quote, most representative bodies have become a hindrance to our market reforms, end quote. Apparently, the free market, said by, quote, reformers to be the very foundation of political democracy, could not be introduced through democratic means. In 1992, the presidents of Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Russia demanded that their parliaments be suspended and they be allowed to rule by presidential decree, with repressive measures against, quote, hardliners and holdovers who resisted the free market, quote, reforms. Their goal was not power to the people, but profits to the privileged. This process of democratization via suppression began even before the actual overthrow of communism. In 1991, Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev, prodded by Russian President Yeltsin, announced that the Communist Party of the USSR no longer had legal status. The party's membership funds and buildings were confiscated. Workers were prohibited from engaging in any kind of political activities in the workplace. 6 leftist newspapers were suppressed, while all other publications, many of them openly reactionary, enjoyed uninterrupted distribution. The U.S. media, and even many on the U.S. left, hailed these acts of suppression as, quote, moving ahead with democratic reforms, end quote. Gorbachev then demanded that the Soviet Congress abolish itself. It had remained too resistant to change. Actually, the Congress was not opposed to democratic debate and multi-party elections. These were already in practice. It resisted an unbridled free market capitalism, and for that reason would have to go. Gorbachev repeatedly cut off the microphones during debate, and threatened single-handedly to abolish the Congress by emergency decree. He forced a vote 3 times until he got the desired abolition. These strong-arm methods were reported in the U.S. press without critical comment. What gave Yeltsin and Gorbachev the excuse to pursue this repressive course was the curious incident of August 1991, when a nervous group of leaders, mouthing vague phrases about the deterioration of life in the Soviet Union, attempted an oddly orchestrated coup against the Gorbachev government, one that flopped before it ever got off the ground. Weeks later, the Washington Post noted happily that the defeat of the coup was a triumph for the Soviet moneyed class. Among the coup's militant opponents were private entrepreneurs and thousands of members of the Russian stock exchange, who routinely made 20 times the average wage of ordinary Soviets. They headed onto, quote, the streets of Moscow to defend their right to wheel and deal. The coup collapsed, democracy triumphed. Private businessmen contributed more than 15 million rubles to buy food and equipment for the defenders. End quote. One broker was struck by how few workers responded to Yeltsin's call to defend democracy. The boldness of this investor class in the face of an armed coup might have another explanation. A socialist critic of communism, Boris Kagarlatsky, argued, quote, "In fact, there was no coup at all. The soldiers were unarmed and confused, and tanks called out were undirected. Quote, and the leaders of the so-called coup never even seriously tried to take power." End quote. The real coup, says Kagarlitsky, came in the aftermath, when Boris Yeltsin used the incident to exceed his constitutional powers and dismantle the Soviet Union itself, absorbing all its powers into his own Russian Republic. While claiming to be undoing the, quote, old regime, Yeltsin overthrew the new democratic Soviet government of 1989 to 91. In late 1993, facing strong popular resistance to his harsh free market policies, Yeltsin went further. He forcibly disbanded the Russian parliament and every other elected representative body in the country, including municipal and regional councils. He abolished Russia's constitutional court and launched an armed attack upon the parliamentary building, killing an estimated 2,000 resistors and demonstrators. Thousands more were jailed without charges or a trial, and hundreds of elected officials were placed under investigation. Yeltsin banned labor unions from all political activities, suppressed dozens of publications, exercised monopoly control over all broadcast media, and permanently outlawed 15 political parties. He unilaterally scrapped the Constitution and presented the public with a new one that gave the president nearly absolute power over policy, while reducing the democratically elected parliament to virtual impotence. Footnote. The new constitution was seemingly approved in a December 1993 referendum. However, a commission appointed by Yeltsin himself found that only 46% of the eligible voters had participated, rather than the 50% required to ratify a constitution. Little note has been taken of the fact that Yeltsin was ruling under an illegal constitution. End footnote. For these crimes, he was hailed as a defender of democracy by U.S. leaders and media. What they most liked about Yeltsin was that he, quote, never wavered in his support for privatization. Footnote. For a more detailed account of the Yeltsin repression and the whitewash it received in the U.S. media, see Yeltsin's Coup and the Media's Alchemy in Michael Parenti's Dirty Truth. End footnote. Yeltsin, the, quote, Democrat, twice suspended publication of the Communist Party's newspaper Pravda. He charged it exorbitant rent for the use of its own facilities. Then, in March 1992, he confiscated the paper's 12-story building and its press, and turned full ownership over to Russiskaya Gazeta, a government pro-Yeltsin newspaper. Yeltsin's elite Oman troops repeatedly attacked leftist demonstrators and pickets in Moscow and other Russian cities. Parliamentary Deputy Andrei Adzierskis, an independent, and Deputy Valentin Martyamanov, a communist, who both vigorously opposed the Yeltsin government, were victims of political assassination. In 1994, journalist Dmitry Koledov, who was probing corruption in high places, was also assassinated. In 1996, Yeltsin won re-election as president beating out a serious challenge from a communist rival. His campaign was assisted by teams of U.S. electoral advisors who used sophisticated polling techniques and focus groups. Footnote: these U.S. political consultants operated in strict secrecy lest they be seen as interfering in Russian affairs, which indeed they were. They advised Yeltsin against making extended speeches and urged more sound bites and photo opportunities. They pointed to issues and images he could exploit and ones he should avoid. Political scientist Larry Sapato, who long opposed the involvement of U.S. consultants in foreign elections, observed that Americans can be stripped of their citizenship for voting in a foreign election. Quote, "Why then should it be acceptable to influence millions of votes in a foreign election?" End quote. I would add that no foreigner is allowed to contribute money to U.S. candidates or work on their campaign staffs. But U.S. leaders can send large sums and secret teams of consultants to manipulate and sway foreign elections. Just another example of the double standard under which U.S. policy operates. End footnote. Yeltsin also benefited from multi-million-dollar donations from U.S. sources and a $10 billion aid package from the International Monetary Fund and World Bank. Equally important for victory was the crooked counting of ballots, as cursorily reported in one ABC late evening news story in July 1996. Yeltsin exercised monopoly control over Russia's television networks, enjoying campaign coverage that amounted to nonstop promotionals. In contrast, opposition candidates were reduced to non-persons, given only fleeting exposure, if that. Yeltsin's re-election was hailed in the West as a victory for democracy. In fact, it was a victory for private capital and monopoly media, which is not synonymous with democracy, though often treated as such by U.S. leaders and opinion makers. Yeltsin's commitment is to capitalism, not democracy. In March 1996, several months before the election, when polls showed him trailing the communist candidate, Gennady Zyuganov, Yeltsin ordered decrees drawn up, quote, that would have canceled the election, closed down parliament, and banned the Communist Party. End quote. But he was dissuaded by advisers who feared the measures might incite too much resistance. Though he decided not to call off the election, quote, Yeltsin was never committed to turning over the government to a communist if he lost. End quote. From the San Francisco Chronicle, 1996. During the 1996 campaign, Yeltsin and his associates repeatedly announced that a communist victory would bring, quote, civil war. In effect, they were voicing their willingness to discard democracy and resort to force and violence if the election did not go their way. Nor was it taken as an idle threat. At one point, surveys showed that, quote, about half the population believed that civil war would result if the communists won. End quote. From the Sacramento Bee, 1996. Through all of this, Yeltsin received vigorous support from the White House and U.S. media. An editorial in The Nation, 1996, asked, what if a popularly elected communist president in Russia had pursued Yeltsin's harsh policies of privatization, plunging his country into poverty, turning over most of its richest assets to a small segment of previous communist officials, suppressing dissident elements, using tanks to disband a popularly elected parliament that opposed his policies, rewriting the Constitution to give himself almost dictatorial power, and doing all the other things Yeltsin has done. Would U.S. leaders enthusiastically devote themselves to the re-election of this, quote, communist president and remain all but silent about his transgressions? The question is posed rhetorically. The Nation editorial presumes that the answer is no. In fact, I would respond, yes, of course. U.S. leaders would have no trouble supporting this, quote, communist president, for he would be a communist in name only. In actual deed, he would be a devoted agent of capitalist restoration. One need only look at how successive administrations in Washington have cultivated friendly relations with the present communist leaders in China, overlooking and even explaining away their transgressions. As China's leaders open their country to private investment and growing economic inequality, they offer up a dispossessed labor force ready to work double-digit hours for subsistence pay, at enormous profit for the multinationals. U.S. politico-economic leaders know what they are doing, even if some editorial writers in this country do not. Their eye is on the money, not the color of the vessel it comes in. Since the overthrow of communism, free market right-wing forces in the various Eastern European countries enjoyed significant financial and organizational assistance from U.S. finance agencies, such as the National Endowment for Democracy, the AFL-CIO's Free Trade Union Institute, a group intimately linked to the CIA, and the Free Congress Foundation, an organization with an anti-communist and conservative religious ideology. Communists and other Marxists endured political repression throughout Eastern Europe. In East Germany, the Party of Democratic Socialism had its property and offices, paid for by party members, seized in an attempt to bankrupt it. In Latvia, the communist activist Alfreds Rubiks, who protested the inequities of free market, quote, reform, has been kept in prison for years without benefit of trial. In Lithuania, communist leaders were tortured and then imprisoned for long durations. Georgia's anti-communist president, Zviad Gamaskulia, incarcerated opponents for some 70 political groups without granting them a trial. Estonia held, quote, free elections, in which 42% of the population was prohibited from voting because of their Russian, Ukrainian, or Belarusian antecedents. Russians and other minorities were excluded from many jobs and faced discrimination in housing and schools. Latvia also disenfranchised Russians and other non-Latvian nationals, many of whom had lived in the country for almost half a century. So much for the flowering of democracy. Footnote. The focus here is mostly on the former communist countries of Eastern Europe and Russia, but similar and more bloody repressions against deposed left revolutionaries have been conducted in Afghanistan and South Yemen. In 1995, in Ethiopia, 3,000 former members of Mengistu's Haile Mariam's socialist government were put on trial for executing Emperor Haile Selassie, the feudal despot who once ruled that country. End of footnote and end of section.